Hi everyone, welcome to the March 19th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I think it's safe to say at this point that we've seen the Kentucky Derby winner race in 2019. I don't know where he's coming from or which races he's won or has not won as of yet, but we've seen all of the major players in action on the Derby Trail after the conclusion of both divisions of the Rebel Stakes last weekend. And we'll get to those races on the Oaklawn Park card, discussing both Rebel races as well as some other stakes races that took place with some top horses from last year coming back to action on that card. We'll also discuss some other races that took place from around the country, a few other stakes races, some up-and-coming three-year-olds. But the main focus of our Pacecast this week is the Rebel Stakes. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and welcome in Craig Milkowski because he was at the Rebel. So, Craig, how was your Rebel Day, and what were your impressions of the crowd and being there live?
It was great. I mean, I always have a great time when I go to Oaklawn. I get treated very well. They love their fans. They get big crowds. I think it was announced at 45,000. They estimate crowds there, but I can tell you the infield was open and there were a lot of people there. I wouldn't want to put a number on it, but just had a great time as always. Couldn't ask for more perfect weather than we had that day. It was glorious all day long. The sun was shining, not too hot, so just a great time.
Yeah, I've never been there. It's a track I'd like to make it to sometime because it looks like it's beautiful. And yeah, I mean, it seemed like a perfect day, and the racing was just top notch throughout the day. I mean, we saw some nice performances early on, and all of the stakes races I thought really lived up to their billing. I mean, just really exciting races. We did see both of Bob Baffert's horses lose. Both heavy favorites, Improbable and Game Winner, went down to defeat. And we'll discuss all of the performances in greater detail. And I think it just kind of throws the whole Derby picture into a little bit more chaos because I think we were looking for this past weekend to clear up some of the uncertainty that was still hanging out there with the return of these two division leaders. And I don't think they lost any real stature in defeat, but none of them really solidified themselves at the top of the division. I think it's still wide open heading into the Kentucky Derby.
Yeah, most people, I think, including myself, were looking for a little more clarity, and we basically got anything but. I don't think you can knock either of the Baffert horses despite losing, but probably added a few more horses to the mix as potential winners of the Derby. I think both of us had actually talked about Long Range Toddy as a horse we liked, and he finally got a not just a clean trip, but really a perfect trip, but he took full advantage and ran very well. Omaha Beach came off that big maiden win and kind of backed it up and showed that he's going to be a real player, trained by Dick Mandela. So, just two good efforts, but this certainly didn't provide any real clearer picture than we had going in.
No, it's true. If anything, we just have even more players to discuss and consider moving forward, kind of all towards the top of the discussion. We'll start by diving into the first division of the Rebel. And as you were saying, Long Range Toddy, who had hinted at having this kind of ability in his prior starts. I know that he's a horse that you have been high on for a while. And, we both discussed after the Southwest that he did not really have the ideal trip that day. He was just kind of stuck down inside, lost momentum at a critical juncture of that race, and really ran on well to be third that day in a race that had more of an outside flow to it while he was coming up the rail. And everything went right for him in this Rebel. I thought John Court gave this horse as perfect a ride as you could possibly imagine. He broke for position out of the gate. As soon as he realized other horses were going, he took back on the backstretch and just slotted into that perfect position, saving ground in behind three horses dueling up front. And he didn't panic at the top of the stretch when Improbable made that early move, angled out and had plenty of time to run him down. He took a big step forward on the speed figure scale. I think this is a legitimate three-year-old.
Yeah, I do as well. I'm, as a bettor, you always kind of want to, maybe be skeptical of perfect trips, but, you also have to have the horse to take advantage. And he certainly got that tactical speed to get good position. And he did show a really nice finishing kick. I mean, turning for home, it probably looked for all the world like Improbable was just going to win easy and maybe he was going to get second, but he seemed to just find that second surge of energy and ran right by him. I think the winning margin was a neck, but it was pretty obvious he was going to pass him, with a couple 100 yards to go, I think. So just a strong effort. I was also pretty impressed with Galilean, to be honest. I mean, I still don't think he's a horse that's really a Derby contender, to be honest, but he ran a little better. He improved to a lifetime best speed figure of 115 on our scale. And, outside the top two, I'm not sure these are ones I want going forward, wherever they happen to show up on the Derby trail. But it was just a solid race through and through.
Yeah, from a trip perspective, there were a lot of things going on, I think, in both editions of the Rebel, but especially this one, because we had a number of horses making premature moves. Galilean, he actually broke a little bit slowly out of the gate and kind of rushed up to contest the pace, which sent Improbable out into the four-path heading into the clubhouse turn. Extra Hope made that backstretch move that kind of forced the hand of Improbable at that point as well. He also had to go wide around the far turn, Improbable did. I think the third and fourth place finishers ran pretty well. They both improved their speed figures and earned new tops in this race. But I think the horse that we really have to discuss is Improbable, because there was a lot of controversy over his trip and whether Drayden Van Dyke perhaps moved too soon on him. I think when you're watching the horses coming around the far turn, there was just a real juxtaposition between the way John Court was handling Long Range Toddy with absolutely no urgency, just sitting inside, knowing that he had the entire stretch to peel out and get by those horses, whereas Drayden Van Dyke was kind of going to an all-out drive around the 5/16 pole, really kind of intent on getting this horse into a winning position by the time they hit the top of the stretch. I think it opens up some additional questions about how far Improbable really wants to go. He is, of course, a son of City Zip, and you don't really think of those as horses that want to go a mile and a quarter. While he does have some stamina pedigree on the bottom side of his pedigree, I think the way that he got run down at the end of this race does open up some concerns about that. But all in all, considering his trip and the fact that Long Range Toddy saved all that ground, I thought Improbable lost nothing in defeat and actually ran pretty well. It's probably the best horse.
He did. One thing I wanted to bring up about this race and even the next division that we're going to talk about soon is after the last couple of weeks of just having insanely fast paces, the pace of both divisions of the Rebel were pretty moderate. And when you get that, you tend to see a lot of these premature moves because, the horses are kind of bunched up and it's a little tougher to get the position you're looking for as the horses don't really spread out. So I do think the pace had something to do with the early moves that we saw, It's kind of easy to knock, but I'm not sure what Improbable could have really done other than wait and hope to get clear later. I don't know how high it was, how important it was for him to win this race on the list of importance. And like you said, I don't really think he lost much in defeat, but just wanted to talk about the pace. Quite a bit different this week than what we've been seeing in the previous 3 or 4 prep races.
Yeah, this day must have been a lot less of a headache for you than some of the prior days that we've seen on the Derby Trail, because all of the races featured relatively moderate paces, and it seemed like the final times, the way they compared to each other, was just pretty straightforward throughout the day, and the track seemed very consistent. So I think you get a really accurate feel for how these horses stack up against each other from a time perspective. And I think people were kind of spoiled with American Pharaoh and Justify coming into the Derby undefeated. I know there was a lot of talk about how we haven't had a Derby winner be defeated during his 3-year-old campaign since, I believe, Animal Kingdom. To me, it's just kind of randomness and the way the prep races line up and just the culture of kind of ducking the top horses and before the Derby comes these days. I don't think either of these horses lost anything in defeat. They both ran really well, Game Winner and Improbable. And to me, statistics like that don't mean a whole lot. I'm not really going to just discount them just because horses in the past have won these races. I mean, these horses ran well enough to win, certainly. Let's move on to the second division of the Rebel, where Omaha Beach held off Game Winner, who again ran a stellar race in defeat. Omaha Beach is a horse that I had kind of doubted coming in. I'm always skeptical of horses coming off big wins over wet racetracks, and that Maiden win where he won by 9 lengths at Santa Anita going to the 6.5 furlongs. That was the highest speed figure by far that he had ever run before. It was just his second start on dirt. I think he validated that form in this race, and if anything, suggested that he's a horse that really might prefer dirt and is not going to have any trouble with the 2 turns. He really surprised me in this race. I mean, he's a horse that I knew had ability coming in. I just didn't expect him to take this kind of step forward.
No, I did. Well, yeah, I was against him at the betting windows. He was, only 4-1. I wound up passing on this race. To be honest, I thought it was not a lot of value in there, but he certainly ran back to that last race in that figure, sloppy track or not. And I know it was a sprint race, but he looked every bit the part of a horse who I expect to get better with some more distance. He did hang on. I mean, it was the tightest of photos. He looked like he was going to get past. He may even, Game Winner may have stuck a nose in front there ever so briefly. But, he showed some gameness. He showed he didn't have to be right on the front. And I liked everything I saw from him. And a really nice 119 TimeformUS speed figure for the effort. Point ahead of Game Winner, and then quite a bit back to third in the long shot Market King. So again, it's just two horses that look like ones that are going to go on. We did see Gunmetal Gray is probably just not very good. He plugged up for fourth again, which we talked about before. So I'm not too high on him. I wasn't before, but I think that was probably the final nail in the coffin for me. But again, I like the top two.
Yeah, I think this race is all about the top two. I think it was over 8 lengths back to the rest of the field. That Dwayne Lucas long shot finished third in this race, which is just kind of an indictment of the rest of the field. They're really not of the same quality as Omaha Beach and Game Winner. But I really thought these two were impressive through the final 16th of a mile. I know some people were saying the Game Winner hung at the end of this race. If you watch them come home the last day, Omaha Beach really dug in, and Mike Smith didn't ask him for his best until they got well within the 8th pole. The final furlong, and he really dug in inside of Game Winner. I mean, Game Winner really put a lot of distance between himself and the rest of the field. So I didn't feel like he was necessarily hanging on the money or not finishing off the race. He was really running. Omaha Beach was just running a little bit faster. And it's kind of funny. Omaha Beach had shown some character flaws at the beginning of his career where he seemed like he was a little reluctant to win races. They were on the turf and one on the dirt, but he just wasn't really, he was in a lot of fights to the wire and just wasn't really getting the job done, was allowing horses to pass him right at the finish. He showed that grit and determination in this race and just refused to let Game Winner by.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think there was any hanging Game Winner at all. I think it just came down to a bob. He actually got a good bob, but it just wasn't quite enough there. And, I expect here he's going back to Santa Anita and probably will stay in Arkansas for the Arkansas Derby. And, with these two apart, I wouldn't be surprised at all if they both win next week. Or not next week, but next time out. And Omaha Beach, I believe, hasn't decided yet, but he's likely to face one of these two Baffert horses. So it should be quite the matchup. Looking forward to it. Yeah,
I am too. And for me, if I were making a list of top Derby horses, I think I'd have to put the Baffert horses right at the top, definitely in the top 3 spots, maybe with Omaha Beach in there somewhere as well. And a horse like Hidden Scroll in there. But I mean, these were among the fastest prep races that we've seen. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the 119 for the second division of the Rebel is the fastest winning prep speed figure that's been given out, at least by us, for this entire prep season. And I thought these horses looked great, and they've got to run a little bit faster to be the Derby winner, I would think. We haven't seen any horses that have won these races get into the 120s yet, which is what you're really looking to see at this time of the year. But we've got the final round of prep races coming up, and these horses do have time to take an additional step forward. And I'll be very interested to see how the matchups shake out and who improves in the final 6 weeks before the Derby. Do you have any feelings on who you'd like to look for moving forward, or any horses moving around in your estimation ahead of the final round of prep races?
No, I mean, I'm looking forward next. I just kind of take them as they come. Looking forward to seeing War of Will this week. If I hope I'm saying that right. And also Hidden Scroll, they're the two big ones that are up next for me. And, just curious. I don't really follow where these horses are going. I just wait to see who shows up in my past performances and kind of go from there.
Let's move on to the 2 other stakes races from Oaklawn Park on Saturday. We'll begin with the Aeri, which went its race 7. And Midnight Bisou came back, and she looked great in victory. If you watch the race coming around the far turn, she just looked like a winner every step of the way. I mean, it's not like Elate was really struggling, but Midnight Bisou, if you watch her ears, I mean, she was just flicking them back and forth coming to the top of the stretch. Mike Smith obviously had a ton of horse underneath him and just kind of had to pick his way through the pack. He was as patient as you would expect him to be in that situation, and he got the seam, and this horse really responded. It seems like she's taken a bit of a step forward now as a 4-year-old. I love the way she finished off this race, and any distance up to a mile and the 16th, I think, is really going to be She's really going to be dangerous doing that. She's a horse that I still doubt wants to go much farther than that. But the finishing speed that she showed at the end of this race, especially considering how slow the pace was, I think all of the fractions were color-coded blue in Timeform US PPs. She ran the final 5/16ths in well under 30 seconds, the final 16th in under 6 seconds. She's just a really strong finisher and a nice, honest filly.
She is. I think this is an interesting race to talk about from a pace perspective, just because basically there was none. On an out-of-the-gate segment, I picked Tappa this week. I mean, I knew she wasn't likely to win, but I also knew she was going to clear, but she just simply wasn't good enough. She went off at 9-1, but it's interesting. We talked about the fairground race back on Risen Star Day, I think it was, where we kind of broke it out because of the pace, and I decided not to do that here. It's always a tough decision. The reason I did that is because it would have inflated the figures of some of the also rans in here that I just wouldn't have been comfortable with. I didn't want to give the impression that Tappa or Eskimo Kisses ran a much better race than what they actually did. But I do think we learned something here. I think Shamrock Rose proved that despite having some success routing before, that she's probably best as a closing sprinter. She wasn't able to hang with the top two at all going down the lane. I mean, she was only beat 2 lengths, but when the pace is this slow, I mean, that's like being beat 4 or 5 lengths in my opinion. Elate ran very well. She was coming off the layoff. Might be a little short for her. But, like you said, Midnight Basue, I was a little worried she wasn't going to get out, but she did look a winner every step of the way through the lane. Once she got clear, she just exploded through there. And I'm kind of hoping these two hook up again, though. I like I've mentioned in one of our other Pacecasts, I think the Apple Blossom is 1 mile and a 16th now. So we're probably going to see more of the same if we do. It's probably right in Midnight Basue's wheelhouse. I would expect Elate to be a little sharper, but I'm not sure that's just the best distance for her.
Yeah, I think the real question moving ahead to the Apple Blossom is whether or not we get a different pace situation, because I just felt like this race wasn't really run to suit Elate's strengths. When we saw Elate throw up that gigantic speed figure in the personal ensign last summer, if you go back and watch that race, it was one where Abel Tassin made an early move, forced the pace on the backstretch. They ended up going pretty honest fractions, I think 46 and change to the half and 110, 134 to the mile. They were really moving throughout that race, and Elate's a horse with some stamina. I mean, she won the 1.25 mile Delaware Handicap last year, so we know that she can go further distances. And I just think a race that kind of set up like this, where they went slowly early and basically sprinted to the wire, it suits a horse like Midnight Basue, who's capable of going shorter distances. I think she's even a graded stakes winner going around 1 turn, whereas Elate really needs the 2 turns and a more fairly run race to show her best qualities. So I'm not down on Elate at all coming out of this race. It's interesting what you said about the speed figure. I was wondering what you would do in this situation, whether you would bump up the number, break it out due to the pace or not. I saw that Bayer actually did that and gave this race a higher number than both editions of the Rebel. I think you're right. This is a race that could have gone either way, and the numbers for the also-rans would have been a little bit too high, I think, otherwise, if you had done that. I'm fine with a slow-paced race getting a lower number. To me, this is a borderline decision anyway. Midnight Basue, if she holds this form, she's a horse that kind of dances every dance, always shows up. We'll see what she does when Monomoy Girl comes back. If she stepped forward, maybe that one's taking a step back. We don't really know yet. But she's going to be a player in all of these big races, in my opinion.
Yeah, I believe I read Monomoy Girl is being pointed to the Apple Blossom as well. So that would be quite the matchup. I hope that does happen, as I will be going back to Oaklawn for Derby Day. So just from a selfish perspective, and I'm sure most racing fans would love to see those 3 horses hook up. You make a good point about Elate. I think she has a high cruising speed, so the slow pace didn't really do her any favors at all. She's always going to have trouble out-quicking a horse like Midnight Basue when it's just a sprint to the wire. So should be a great matchup. I do hope some speed shows up. I'm not sure where it's going to come from. You never know with that. They tend to get a lot of local horses in there, and hopefully we get a bigger field for this one.
Hopefully it's not coming from our friend Amy's challenge, who they were talking about running in that Apple Blossom. Hopefully they've come to their senses on that one. Moving on to the colts, the older horses in the Essex Stakes. Now, this race got a higher speed figure than the Aeri, but I think that's merely a function of the pace, because these are not some of the top older horses that are out there. To me, this was even a weaker race than we saw on the Razorback on Southwest Day. Rated R Superstar, who won this race, I thought he ran well to win. He made a blitz around the far turn, kind of moving a little bit early to make the lead at around the 8th pole, and he was able to hold on late as horses were battling back inside. I thought Snapper Sinclair, who finished second, was really game to come back after contesting an honest pace. But these are not the top horses of the handicap division, and I think the speed figure of 117 kind of speaks to that fact.
Yeah, I remember us discussing who would show up for this race back when Coletown won the Rebel, and it turned out the best finisher that did show up, Rated R Superstar, took this race. But a very weak race for a race that had a $350,000 purse. Not to take anything away from the top two, they ran well, but giant expectations. He is what he is. He tends to run his best races when he's on the lead, which he had no chance of making in here and didn't particularly try. I mean, they all ran okay, but just not a race I'm going to get excited about. These horses are probably grade 3 at best, and that's where I expect that we'll see most of them.
Yeah, Giant Expectations was the one horse that could have made this a true grade 2, grade 3 type of race based on his prior form out in California, but it just seems like he's really lost a step at this point. He did break slowly in this race and lost about a length of position at the start, but he rushed up after that, got into good position, was right there at the 8th pole and just couldn't seal the deal. I think he now hasn't won a race since 2017 when he last beat Accelerate, and he's just a horse that has gone in the wrong direction. So to me, beating him is no great feat. The two other races that I want to discuss from Saturday at Oaklawn, one was a maiden race and the other was an allowance race that took place earlier on the card. The faster of the two was actually the maiden race, which went as, I believe, the 5th, as Warrior's Charge improved off his prior starts to earn a 110 TimeformUS speed figure. Pretty impressive for a maiden race, but I think that this horse got an absolutely perfect trip in doing so.
Yeah, I mean, he was clear the whole way. He never got challenged at any point. But, to his credit, he ran fast. I mean, a 110, it's not too far off of what we saw in the two divisions of the Rebel. He's pretty lightly raced for Cox, the trainer. And, who knows? I doubt they would try him in a race like the Arkansas Derby. He's not ready for that. Maybe something like the Lexington would seem logical, but I haven't read up on it to see what the intent is on him. But he certainly looked good, and he would add some pace to any of those races where he shows up.
Yeah, I do think it's notable that his fraction at the 3/4 mark, the 6 furlongs in, was almost a full second slower than what they went in the Rebel. So he really did slow down the pace coming to the top of the stretch. And I think that's what allowed him to sprint home in such visually impressive fashion, because he really was moving at the end of that race. He was coming home almost as fast as Midnight Bisou in the Aeri. It's just he had a much softer pace scenario than the Rebel horses when he was achieving that final time. So I think he's a nice horse. He's a horse that is improving. I just think that the way the race set up allowed him to run a faster speed figure than he might have under different circumstances. And I think it's worth discussing that as we move on to the second race, also at that distance from earlier in the card, as Last Judgment won an allowance race over Desmond. Neither one of these horses had perfect trips, though Desmond was the one that really had everything go wrong after a poor start and just a wide trip around both turns. He's a better horse than that, but it's a little alarming that he was so unprofessional in this race.
Yeah, I would say even though the figure's a little less than the Warrior's Charge win, these two probably are horses I'd like a little bit more going forward. Last Judgment, like you mentioned, it wasn't a great trip. I think he was wide on both the turns. He was wide pretty much all the way. So to run a 105, it was a decent effort. First try around 2 turns. Certainly no knocks other than it wasn't particularly fast with the 105. Desmond, he ran well. He was the heavy favorite in here. He was one of 4 Bob Baffert horses that lost, all at pretty short prices. I think he was the shortest, believe it or not, I think he was shorter than Game Winner. But yeah, my wife actually was with me. She took a great picture of the start of this race, just happened to catch it. And you can see all the other horses are a full stride and a half out of the gate, and Desmond's still fully in the gate. So, he basically cost himself the whole race at the start. To get as close as he did was fairly impressive. He got a 103 speed figure coming off a 112 last out when he was second in that sprint stake, the 7th furlong sprint stake at Santa Anita. So good effort. But, I was kind of wondering looking at that last race, why didn't Bob put him in one of the divisions of the Rebel? And maybe that's why. Maybe he's just not professional, not ready enough for that kind of competition just yet.
Yeah, that could be it. Because like you were saying, I was really impressed with his San Vicente. I thought he ran exceptionally well that day and was arguably the best horse coming out of that race. And he's supposed to have no problem stretching out in distance. He's a son of Union Rags. There's some route pedigree on the dam side. I saw that Bob Baffert took the blinkers off for this race, and maybe that was part of the reason that he just wasn't quite as focused. And I mean, you never want to see a horse just standing in the gate like that when they open them up, because he just doesn't have his mind on running. I mean, he ran well within the context of the race after that, because he did just have nothing go right for him, having to go wide around both turns and making that premature move while just under a ride the entire way. He was even ducking in the stretch, kind of not running in a straight line. I think this horse does have real ability. It's just he's got to figure some things out, and I don't think he's ready for a final round Derby prep just yet. And given the strength and the depth in the Bob Baffert barn, I don't think they're going to be hard pressed to send him into one of those races. As for the winner last judgment, I mean, he broke a little bit slowly too. He kind of did that typical Todd Pletcher break that we've been seeing lately, where he broke about a length slowly. But he was able to get right back into the race thereafter and got a relatively good trip. He was a little wide around both turns as well, not quite as wide as Desmond. But he finished off strongly. I don't know if this horse really wants to go that much farther looking at his pedigree. He's got more of like a one-turn miler kind of pedigree, so I'm not sure he's really a Derby horse. And they've got to run a little bit faster to be considered legitimate threats in the upcoming stakes races. But I thought both of these horses ran fine within the context of the race.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think either one of them are ready for the Derby trail. Just speed from a speed figure perspective, if either one of them showed up in one of the big 100-point preps, they're going to be huge prices, I would imagine. So solid efforts, and horses, nothing wrong with putting them in your stable mail and seeing where they show up. But, not too excited about them as Derby contenders.
Moving away from Oaklawn Park, we'll discuss another 3-year-old that made some waves on Saturday. That was Always Mining in the private terms at Laurel. I don't think that this horse is being pointed towards the Kentucky Derby. I didn't see any definitive post-race quotes about that. I believe that they're more interested in a race like the Preakness, because I think they were talking about moving on to the Federico Tessio for his next race. But this horse is running just as fast as some of the top Derby contenders. He earned a 1:15 TimeformUS speed figure in this race. I know that he wasn't really facing any serious competition, and it wasn't a particularly taxing pace, but this horse, from a visual standpoint, was just utterly dominant throughout, and he had no trouble handling the stretch out to the 2 turns. This horse has some real ability.
He does, and just a little correction. He actually ran a 1:17. I've wrote it wrong on our notes, but the chart just showed the 1:17, and he actually ran a 1:19 final time. He did set a little bit of a slowish pace, and he was well clear while doing so. So, if we're going to talk about an easy trip, this is the epitome of an easy trip. But as you said, I mean, you can only run against who shows up against you. And this horse, I think, is just loaded with talent. I look forward to seeing him. I think you were correct about the Preakness. I believe that is the goal at this point in time. And he obviously doesn't have any points. And if he runs in the Tessio, he won't have any there. So definitely he'll probably be the local horse in the Preakness. And we've seen several of those run well over the years. And this horse is as talented as any I can remember in quite a while.
Yeah, he's kind of a fascinating horse just looking back at his career. He actually started in 4 long sprint race at Keeneland back last spring. I believe he was owned by James Maxwell then, racing for trainer Laura Wohlers. And at some point last summer, he was a private purchase for these new connections. And ever since Kelly Abrubli got this horse, she has just done an outstanding job with him. I mean, she turned him into a front runner. You started using his speed. And ever since he's made the lead in these races, he's just been unstoppable. It does seem like he's a need the lead type, because we haven't really seen him put forth one of these gigantic efforts without the early lead. And he's going to face some tougher pace rivals in the future if they are moving on to a race like the Preakness. But when he gets in front, he's pretty dangerous. And he's a horse that I'd be a little bit afraid of if we come up to a race like the Preakness and there's not a ton of pace.
Yeah, agree. And as we've mentioned before, not a whole lot of, speed horses are moving on with points and showing a lot of ability. Changed a little bit if you want to consider Omaha Beach a speed horse in the Rebel, but we still don't have a whole lot of early speed horses, that look to be wanting further and going on along the Derby trail. So a horse like this could prove to be super dangerous if he gets an easy lead.
I completely agree. The fastest race that we saw at Laurel last Saturday was Lewisfield, who won the Not for Love, I believe for the second year in a row. I think he won this race last year as well. This is a horse that's based at Charlestown. Charlestown horses have had some luck at Laurel Park this winter because they also won the Barbara Fritchie with Late Night Powwow. This horse put in quite the performance to win this Not for Love. I think looking in the charts, he earned a raw final time figure of 131, which was obviously adjusted down because of the slow pace. But this horse put forth quite the effort. And when he gets the right trip and when he's on, he's capable of running some pretty fast races.
Yeah, he's done this a few times in his career where he just flies. That 131 is exactly right. The final time was really fast. And, I mean, this wasn't some shot in the dark speed figure. They ran a really good card at Laurel, a lot of stakes races on Saturday, some really solid field. So there was plenty of data to work with. And I actually went and timed this race just to be sure. Laurel and all the Maryland races get put on YouTube so I can time them really easily. And it was spot on. All the fractions were good. The final time was good. So just a solid effort. And I also think the runner-up ran well as well, Rockin' On By, who was basically the only horse to make up any ground at all, coming from 5.5 lengths back. He at least did make up a couple lengths. And seeing how fast Louisfield was running, through the stretch, that's pretty notable in my opinion. So both of these two look really good to me, and I'd be curious to see them face some better competition.
Yeah, I think you make a good point about the runner-up. He really did put in a good effort through the stretch because this was one of those rare 6 furlong races where Louisfield went every single quarter in under 23 seconds. He went 22 and change for every quarter of the race, including the final one. That's just something you don't see that often at all. But that also speaks to the fact that the pace of this race, especially in the early going, was pretty slow. It's why he was able to run so quickly at the end. And we do see some quick come home times at Laurel when horses are able to relax up front. So I think that made it tough on the closers, but there's no denying that Louisfield is a really nice horse. And like you were saying, the sprint division is a little bit open right now because we saw some horses not come back quite the same. Imperial Hint might not be the horse that he once was. So maybe if Louisfield travels north again, I think he was entered in a few races at Belmont or Aqueduct last year. I don't know if they actually tried any of them. I think he was entered in the fall highweight. I don't believe he ran there. But he's a horse that I could see them taking a shot with in a few of those graded stakes races because he does have real ability. And based on this speed figure, he's certainly good enough right now to step up.
Yeah, he is. Now, speaking of races that didn't turn the page for me, we had the inside information at Gulfstream. Being at Oaklawn, I didn't get to see this live, but I did go back and watch it. And this is about as weak of, I believe it's a grade 2 race for filly and mare sprinters. And this is about as weak as you're going to find. It's not surprising when you see the odds of the top two were 11-1 and 12-1. Nobody looked particularly strong going into this race from a figure perspective. So to see him earn a 112 and a 111, it's not really surprising, but it's still a little disappointing. You hope somebody's going to jump up and show up and run a big one, but we just didn't have it here. And I will happily bet against this entire field when they show up next time.
Yeah, somebody on Twitter was asking me a question about how to use the TimeformUS race ratings when you're handicapping races. And I think this race is actually a pretty good example because this was a grade 2 race. And if you were looking for a par speed figure for a grade 2 race that horses might have to achieve to win a race at this level, you might believe that all of these fillies were in a particularly tough spot. But when you look through the field, and I believe the preliminary race rating for this race was only a 114, which is not that high for a grade 2 race on the dirt. You kind of get the sense that this was one of the weaker grade 2 races that we're going to see this season. And the fact that it earned a speed figure of just 112 really illustrates that fact. A horse like America's Tail, if you were handicapping the race based on class, you might think, oh, well, she's not really good enough to win a grade 2 race because she's coming off some weaker listed stakes wins at the Fairgrounds and Laurel. But she's a horse that was in good form at this time, and she was able to make that transition into graded stakes company merely because it was a fairly weak field.
Yeah, she had actually, time she ran on dirt, albeit around 2 turns, she ran a 118, which actually looked really good against the group. So she was able to handle it. And like we said, this was a slow speed figure, so I don't want to give the wrong impression. This isn't one of those ones that was affected by pace. The pace was solid enough. Just wasn't a great group. So, nothing to excuse it. For example, talking about the Midnight Bassoon race, I mean, as a figure guy, that's a race I'm just putting a line through without really knocking the horses, because I'm saying that was due to pace. But in this case, I'm knocking the horses. They're just not that good, and this was a grade 2 in name only.
Yeah, and this is a division that is pretty hungry right now because the Breeders' Cup winner from last year, Shamrock Rose, we saw her stretch out in the Aeri. I don't know if they're going to turn her back for a race like the Madison or the Humana Distaff on Derby Day, but I'll bring her up again. Amy's Challenge, who's just been running these giant speed figures out of town at Oaklawn. It seems like a race like the Madison or the Humana Distaff would be there for the taking for a horse that's in form right now, because I don't know who's coming back from the Breeders' Cup last year. The horses that we've seen in some of these graded stakes races for affiliate mare sprinters just have not been running particularly fast. So I don't know who's going to show up for the Grade 1 races that are coming up pretty soon, but you can sew up a championship if you win those races early in the season. So if I were the connections of a horse's mobility like Amy's Challenge, I would certainly be looking to take a shot in those races.
Yeah, I agree. And just as a point of comparison, the next race we're going to talk about, the correction at Aqueduct, otherwise known, I think, as the Linda Rice Invitational, where she saddled 4 of the 6 horses. The top 4, at least, who I'm looking at right now, all ran better speed figures than what we saw in the inside information. And winners start with Silver. I thought she ran a solid race, as did Yorkie Poo Princess. And, it was a little tightly grouped at the finish, which, often will tell you maybe the field wasn't that strong. But I think this might be a little bit of the exception. I think the figure here was legit. The pace was solid enough. Just a good group of fillies.
Yeah, I think the most amazing part about this race was the fact that Linda Rice actually started all 4 horses, because she's a trainer that's known to scratch when she doesn't like the spot that her horse might be in. She made up for it on Sunday at Aqueduct, and I think she scratched 3 horses on the card, but she ran them all in this correction. Start with Silver. She's a horse that I liked coming into the race. I didn't think I think she went off at 5-2. I thought it should be a better price than that. But she was my best bet on the card, because she had been way against the track in her prior start when they came off the layoff against New York breds. It was a gold rail day at Aqueduct, and she was just wide throughout. So you knew that she was better than that performance. And if you went back to last year, she's a horse that had run some speed figures that put her right in the mix. And she got back to her best races in this correction. I like the Junior Alvarado got back on board her, because he just rides this filly perfectly, or I should say the 6-year-old mare now. She's a horse that originally was a turf horse at the beginning of her career, and she runs like a turf horse because she needs to be covered up early. She needs to be reserved off the pace, and when he gets her out into the clear in the stretch, she just comes with that burst of speed, that turfy turn of foot on the dirt, and she can run these horses down. It looked for a second like she might hang towards the end, because Yorkie Poo Princess was really battling back inside of her, and she's a horse that has really gotten good lately for Ed Barker. She's gotten in very good form, and she's run some faster speed figures, but Start with Silver got the job done and bailed out the Linda Rice foursome.
Yeah, for those wondering, my co-host is probably a little too modest, but you should always check out what he writes. Whether you agree with his picks or not, he always gives some good information. All his race previews show up at TimeformUSblog.com. I think a lot of them are at DRF website and also the Naira website. So there's my shameless plug for David. Now I'll let you move
on. At least I didn't have
to
do it. Another race to discuss from Aqueduct was one that took place on Sunday. It was the Gander for New York bred 3-year-olds. This was just a 4-horse field. I think it scratched down from 5 or maybe 6 originally. I forget how many were originally entered. I also make the morning line at Naira, and this is one that I'm happy to say I got completely wrong. I made Durkin's call the longest shot on the morning line of the 4 horses that were entered, and it was just one of those they knew situations, because he was bet down to even money off the private purchase and trainer switched to Bill Mott. I guess that mattered a lot to people, and they were right about it, because this was just a different horse than the one that we had seen racing for Mike Trombetta. He ran a much higher speed figure. Well, not much higher. He ran a faster speed figure based on the TimeformUS numbers. And he was just utterly dominant throughout. He's a horse that wanted to be close to the pace in his prior starts, but they had no problem taking him off the pace on this occasion. And he just finished off the race beautifully. I really liked what I saw. And he's a horse that could be competitive in some New York bred stakes moving forward.
Yeah, he could. I mean, he ran a 110 TimeformUS speed figure, very, very solid for the effort. He ran down a loose on the lead horse who wasn't going particularly fast early. A good horse, and I won't even pretend to know how to say it, Kosciuszko, something like that. And
yeah, I don't think anybody knows.
But, I'm always a little impressed when you see him run down those horses like that who were the top 2 were clear early. They were both running all by themselves early, and he didn't just win. I mean, he just blew them away. toyed with the field. So he's one I'm looking forward to follow. He's looked good every time I've seen him run, and this was by far his best yet.
Yeah, he's the kind of horse that I think could be very dangerous in a race like the Mike Lee, which they run on that Empire Showcase card. And I think Memorial Day, sometime in late May, they've got a bunch of New York bred races. The start of that New York bred triple that includes the New York Derby and the Albany. He's a horse that could be very dangerous in races like that. As could the next horse that we're going to talk about. I wanted to talk about two non-stakes races that took place last weekend, one of which was an allowance race on Friday at Aqueduct for New York bred 3-year-olds, and Stonebreaker won a 6-furlong race. And he's another horse that could be a Mike Lee kind of horse because he ran the same Timeformula speed figure as Durkin's Call. He also got a 110. And he's a horse that is coming out of a race that was, I think, a little bit difficult for speed figures to get a handle on. It was one of those races that I think you actually gave the same number as Beyer originally, which kind of just speaks to the disparity in how you could view the race. And I think it was a race that the Beyer has proved to be a little bit too high originally. Maybe the number we gave was a little bit too low because this horse came back with a big effort next time out. But the number for that race, it just didn't make a whole lot of sense compared to the rest of the card, or I should say the final time. It was just one of those outlier races on the day. But in this race last Friday, Stonebreaker set a contested pace, was battling inside of another horse, and he just rebroke at the top of the stretch and ran away from that other speed horse who faded to be off the board. He's a pretty nice New York bred 3-year-old.
He is. I haven't had a chance to watch this race. I did do the figures. That's one of the problems when I go out of town. I don't get to catch all the races I like to, but certainly no knock on the figure. The second and third place horses ran about what they've been running before, so it wasn't a very tough figure to make. And like you said, that 110 matches up perfectly with Durkin's Call, and almost sure they'll have a showdown at some point, probably sooner rather than later.
One other race for 3-year-olds that I want to mention from the fairgrounds on Saturday. I like to dig through all the charts before doing this podcast every week and just kind of catch up on some races that I might have missed. And one race that just really stuck out to me was this maiden race that went as the 9th on Saturday, where two first-time starters finished first and second for the Joe Sharp barn, but the winner, Tough Love, was really visually impressive. If you watched this race, it was a muddy track at the fairground, so maybe take the results with that in mind. But this horse was just never asked for his best. Gabriel Saez, who was on him, just kind of was coaxing him at the top of the stretch under a hand ride, never really set him down, never went to the whip. This horse just kind of won in hand. The pace was not particularly fast. I think if they got a blue color-coded second and third fraction in the TimeformUS charts. But I loved the way that this horse won. He just has this daisy cutter stride to him where he just skips over that muddy track, and he seems like a horse with real ability moving forward.
He did. This is a race I did make sure I watched when you sent the write-up of what we were going to talk about today. And I think the 3-length margin of victory is a little bit deceptive. He's one that probably could have won easier. And, these races are always a little tricky when you go forward, when you get the fractions coded in blue for a first-time starter. The inclination is you want to knock them and say they didn't do anything, but I think the visual is really important in these cases. I think it always helps to go back and watch the race. It's easy to say they could have ran faster, that they had a good pace, but the visual in this case tells me this horse probably has more in the tank. And it's also a good sign, I think, when they run a little bit slower and aren't all out. I'd rather see the blue fractions than the red fractions if we're talking about horses that are going to be stretching out in the future and maybe moving into tougher competition. And this horse certainly showed that he probably has the ability to do that.
Yeah, this is a race that I would go back and watch if you got a chance, because this horse really impressed me. And he's one that I could see showing up in a tough numbers one allowance race like we often see at Keeneland, or perhaps on Derby weekend at Churchill Downs. I'm sure that's the kind of race that Joe Sharp would be looking at next. But even the runner-up, Run and Ray, was also making his first start for the same barn. I thought he ran very well within the context of that race because he was the one horse to make a little bit of a late run into that slow pace. And he's one that's bred to stretch out a little bit because the dam is a half to Dubai World Cup winner, well armed. So there's real stamina on the bottom side of his pedigree. Both of these are nice horses, and I'll be interested to see where they go from here.
Yeah, and this is one of the things I talk about using our charts a lot. And you can see the third and fourth place place finishers were no slouches in here. They had run in their last time out 97 and 95 speed figures in the same race, which is going to win a whole lot of maiden special weight races all around the country at big tracks in New York and California, as well as the fairgrounds. And both of them ran well again. They ran 97 and 96 this time. They just happened to run into two really tough customers. So definitely a future there. It's not like they were beating nothing. I think they beat two really good maidens in here.
Yeah, I totally agree. I like to look at that same thing just to make sure that these first-time starters are as good as they seem. It's something that I know we did when we were analyzing a maiden race like Hidden Scrolls, when there was some horses in the race with prior form and they ran back to their prior speed figures. And it turns out they didn't regress at all behind an impressive debut winner. And this could be the same case with these horses. I think both of these first-time starters have real ability. And there are some nice 3-year-olds out there. Moving ahead to next weekend, I don't know if you took a look yet at the Louisiana Derby or the Sunland Park Derby. Both of these races are already drawn, thankfully, so we can get a little head start on them, or at least I can, because I've got to write analysis of both of those races. I haven't made picks yet, but it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because we're already moving ahead to the final round of Derby preps. I think the Louisiana Derby is the first prep that's awarding 100 points to the winner, so we should start to get a clearer picture if a horse like War of Will can solidify his spot in the Derby field or atop the standings. I'm interested to see how these horses run.
Yeah, I am as well. I'm old enough to remember when the fairgrounds race would be just a prep for like another prep, but now this is probably the last time we're going to see the horses that run well before the Derby. I did look at them. It drew a big field. It always amazes me the fairgrounds can draw their races and have past performances out a week ahead of time. I absolutely love it. It doesn't seem to be a problem for them. And Sunland actually did the same thing. Their Sunday card's already out and available. One of the Bob Baffert horses is shipping in for that one. So looking forward to both these cards. The fairgrounds card looks really tough, top to bottom. Really good races, a lot of stakes races. So going to be a fun weekend. Kind of glad they're on different days. One's on Saturday, one's on Sunday, but looking forward to it.
I agree. Got some ideas in those races, so I'll write them up, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, and we'll recap these races, of course, next week on the podcast. So, Craig, thanks for discussing these races again this week, and you can always listen to us on drf.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, SoundCloud. Just search for Daily Racing Form, the TimeformUS Pacecast, and check us out in the future. Thanks for listening this week, guys. See you next week.